everybody, Michael Davis here. Welcome to our final Bone2Pick interview of 2019. Before we start in, we want to wish everybody very happy holidays and a very healthy and prosperous 2020. We're very fortunate to close out our Bone2Pick year with a sit down with one of the great trumpet players on the international jazz scene, Mr. Jim Rotondi. We shot this interview a few weeks back when Jim was in town performing at Dizzy's with the supergroup One for All. Jim is currently the professor of jazz trumpet in Graz, Austria at the University of Music and Dramatic Arts. Prior to that, he had forged a very successful career in New York City as a jazz artist, performing on over 80 albums as a side musician. He has toured and recorded with a variety of jazz luminaries, including Ray Charles, Lionel Hampton, Toshiko Akiyoshi, Lou Donaldson, Curtis Fuller, Eric Alexander, George Coleman, just to name a few. He has released 16 CDs as a solo artist. He's currently the leader of the Jim Rotondi Electric Band, as well as co-leading about a half dozen groups on the international and European jazz scene. As I mentioned earlier, he is a founding member of the supergroup One for All. He hails from the great state of Montana and received his education at the esteemed University of North Texas. My own connection to Jim goes way, way back, and one of my fondest memories is playing with the great Bob Mintzer Big Band. We did some touring and recording with Bob, and Jim always sounded so wonderful. So super looking forward to this and getting a chance to hear about his extraordinary career. Before we jump into the interview, we really appreciate all your support through the years, especially this past year. If you like what you're hearing in the interview series and what we're doing here at Hip-BoneMusic, please like our Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. We always appreciate that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to the great Jim Rotondi. Great to see you again, Jim. Thank you for taking time out of your crazy busy schedule while you're in New York, and thanks for being with us.
Man, thank you a million for inviting me, and I just want to say right up front, I'm so honored to be a part of what you're doing here, man, because I think this archive of interviews you're doing is incredible, and I may have mentioned to you in an email, but one of the interviews, I've watched a whole lot of them, but one of them in particular with Malcolm McNabb, his regular dietary nutrition for some of my students, because it's so on point about how he fixed a couple of problems, and I just love it, man. So thanks for all
Man, thank you, Jim. That means a ton coming from you, and I have a feeling today's interview is going to be a great stuff as well.
Let's dig in and see what we can find.
Okay, sounds good. Let's talk about your early years growing up in Montana, which is typically not producing that many great jazz artists, but obviously it can. I know you came from a very musical household. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about your starting on piano and then migrating over to trumpet. Just tell us about those early years.
Okay, so my mom was a piano teacher, and in our family, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and in our family, we all were required to take piano lessons from the age of 8 until graduating high school, and then we were given the option to take an instrument that was played in the band later on, which I obviously wanted to do because for me playing the piano was all by myself, in a room or practicing exercises or whatever. But then the opportunity to play with other musicians was very appealing to me, so I jumped at the chance. I started out actually, I wanted to play the trombone because my next oldest brother was already playing the trombone. And it's kind of funny, but believe it or not, my next oldest brother is as tall as you are.
Oh, okay.
So he was already playing the trombone, and I said, I want to do that. And they said, well, show us what you got. And I couldn't even get to third, and I still can't get to third. So, they said, well, try the French horn. And I took it home for a day, and I just couldn't get a sound out of it. It was just awful. So I said, well, I'm going to try the trumpet if it's okay. And they said, well, we can take one more, but okay. And so that's how that got started. And then literally maybe only 2 years after that, a friend of mine in that same junior high band had a Clifford Brown and Max Roach vinyl set. So, to hear Clifford Brown 2 years after you start playing the trumpet in Montana was pretty eye-opening, to say the very least, And so anyway, I continued studying both instruments until graduating high school, and that's the Montana part of the story.
There you go. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the impact that Clifford has, right? When you listen to him, he's
So
still,
clear,
and
so perfect. It's
just
unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. And from there, you went to University of North Texas, which I guess back then was North Texas State. Is that correct?
Correct.
And
well, actually, no. Let me interject one thing. I went to school for 2 years at the University of Oregon in Eugene as an undeclared major. I hadn't actually made the decision yet, and in fact, just to back up a tiny bit, I mentioned my mom was a piano teacher. My father was the enforcer of the rules in our house. But interesting sort of paradox about that is that he wasn't really thrilled when I told him I wanted to be a musician after having forced me to take piano lessons for for however many years. So I mean, there's no ill will there or anything like that, but I just think it's kind of funny, and I did kind of hover for 2 years thinking, well, maybe I will see if there's something else I want to do. But all I was doing was practicing. I wasn't going to classes or anything, So, and I was spending all the money he sent me buying vinyl, so it seemed like it was a pretty clear choice at that point,
All right, cool. Well, University of Oregon is a great, it's a great campus and school there as well.
Yeah, now it's a super great program.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so after those couple of years, you did end up at North Texas, which I'm sure was very inspiring and motivational. What was that experience like for you?
Well, talk about eye-opening. So some of the cats that were there that Frank Green,
Sure.
One of the most recorded and heard trumpet players on the planet now, and what a great guy too. I just love him. And also Mike Williams, who played lead trumpet on the Count Basie band for 30-some years, just retired. He and I and Frank were in the same lab band trumpet section together. So, I mean, the way those guys were playing at that age, especially Frank, I mean, I remember hearing him when he was like 17 or 18, and I just had no conception of how you could have that ability on the trumpet at that age.
Wow, okay.
So when I got to North Texas, my complete groove was learning how to play the instrument. I mean, I had been listening to the music and digging that and doing the piano stuff, but I felt like, wow, if this is where the level of the trumpet is at university level, then I've got some work to do. So that's, I studied with Don Jacoby down there, and he showed me, as he showed a lot of people, just a tremendous amount,
Was Leon Breeden still there, or was Neil?
He had actually just retired. Neil started something like 2 years before I got there.
Okay, and for those who don't know, we're talking about Neil Slater, a great educator and arranger and composer. And,
Personality,
yes, the legendary stories about his motivational tactics with the band.
Yes, we cannot talk about them.
They're effective though. I think very effective.
Certainly are.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's talk about one thing that stood out when doing a little bit of research for this interview was how you won the ITG trumpet competition back in 1984. And I know right now that seems probably like something that's not even on your radar, but I know those things are pretty important, like those, and they bring a lot of visibility to a young player like yourself in 1984. Tell me a little bit about that and what, if you can, whatever your memories were of that experience.
So first of all, it was on the campus of Bloomington, Indiana, IU, and I was really excited about that because I got to visit Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which was very important to me at that time. So that's one of the things that I remember. But also, I just remember being completely, again, sort of overwhelmed by the whole community that I was meeting, and all these great trumpet players of all different, sort of styles and proficiencies, and I feel like, I sort of remember playing that day in the competition and not sort of like standing on air or something. I don't even remember what the sensory thing was like. And I really want to also make sure that, to be correct about it, I actually tied for first place with another wonderful trumpet player, Craig Frederick, who was also studying at North Texas at the time.
Oh, wow, okay.
So they gave us both first place in that competition.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. Well, let's talk about moving to New York and your career starting in earnest then. I think now, when you look back on it, it seemed overwhelming at the time when we moved to New York, but now it seems like even, when I look at young folks today, what their task is. So I think it's always helpful for them to hear somebody like yourself
Yeah.
who's a successful jazz artist, like what your path was like. But in particular, before we get into your recording career and all that, but what were those early months and years like in
Initial
New York for
recollections?
you? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say that, so I visited New York on a spring break when I was at North Texas, and I remember thinking, as I was walking off the plane, I'm going to live here. Before, I mean, I was so taken in by the the wrecked cars right next to the highway, and like I thought, wow, this is heavy. I mean, I come from Montana, and then Texas is clean and nice and everything, and I had never really seen anything like that. And also, I should add that my parents are both New Yorkers. My mom's from Brooklyn, and my father was from Newark.
Oh wow.
So it was also in a way very much spiritually like coming home for me, even though I had never really spent any time there. I just felt immediately like this is going to be my spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I should also say that before I got to New York, I actually thought I was pretty good. And I thought, yeah, man, I'll play some changes. I know some tunes. And I lived in a place in Brooklyn with 4 other guys, and one of them you probably know, George Whitty, the cat that
Of course,
that produced all the
yeah,
stuff with
amazing,
Randy
yeah.
and Michael and
Yeah,
all
of
that,
course.
just incredible musician. And he was living in the room right next to mine, that was a converted office. It was kind of like this, and the cats put their walls up by themselves with no insulation or no nothing in the walls. So we heard everything that everybody was practicing. We heard, and so I got to hear George actually through my wall sequence that whole Return of the Brecker Brothers.
Wow.
And then
Oh my
Mike and
gosh.
Randy were coming by the crib, just to check it out and see what So that was deep, that was
Wow.
super sensory overload there. But that was maybe just a little bit later. When I first moved to town, I kind of hooked up a little bit right away because I had a friend who was subbing on a off-Broadway show called Beehive, which was playing at the Village Gate. And it was like an R&B review of girl groups.
Okay.
From the 60s, I think. And so we were doing Aretha Franklin, and we were doing Dusty Springfield and stuff that I had never done before, which was a very cool experience for me because horn section, and I got the tour with it because the cat Chris Anderson decided he didn't want to go.
Okay.
And so he gave it to me, and that was like only 3 or 4 months after I moved to town. So I was kind of really feeling good,
Yeah.
for a while, and then I came back and it really slowed down, and I started doing a lot of weddings and the kind of stuff that a lot of musicians have to do to establish themselves and meet other cats and all that stuff. And so that would have been like the first 4 years that I was here.
Okay.
And then you alluded to Ray Charles. That happened in 1991.
Okay. So that was kind of like your first big
Name
break.
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I went out on the road for a few months with the Artie Shaw band from Boston. It was a great band.
Who was
really great cats.
who led that?
Dick Johnson at
Dick
that time,
Johnson,
clarinet
right.
player.
Clarinet player from Boston,
Incredible
right,
clarinet player too.
Right.
So that was my first kind of what I would say pro road gig.
Okay.
But then that didn't last long, and then Ray happened in 1991.
Nice. And that must, the stories about Ray are as legendary as the stories about Buddy Rich and, all these eclectic, interesting band leaders of that period. But that must have been amazing just hearing him sing every night, though.
Oh, man. Well, I often think about how much I learned on that gig. And so I like to tell the story of how I got the gig, too, because it's kind of funny. So in that loft I was living in Brooklyn, we had one of those answering machines that had a cassette tape in it. Obviously that doesn't exist anymore, but for you young folks, that we had an answering machine with a cassette in it, and one of the cats on the band was a friend of mine, and he had told me some months earlier that there was going to be a turnover in the next tour, like 4 trumpet chairs. So he said, send him a tape with your group, and I didn't have a group. I did have a turntable. And I had the Jamie Aebersold Charlie Parker.
Okay.
And I had a cassette recorder at that time where you could plug in a source. So I put on that thing and put a mic in it, and I just played along with it and sent it to Ray and told him it was my band, even though you could hear the scratches and And
That's great.
So I was playing like Yardbird Suite and the blues and whatever. And so I came home one night from whatever, and there on that little cassette, Jim, it's Brother Ray. sending you a ticket. You'll be out in LA in next week or whatever it was. And I just assumed, this is somebody playing, cranking me, So, and a regret that I have is that I did not keep that cassette, because
Oh, man, yeah.
that would have been the bootleg Ray Charles of all time for me, But yeah, so that was a great gig, man. I really liked it. Some people tell different stories, but what I loved about Ray was, and it's a lesson for every musician, I think, and for people in other walks of life as well, is that he was always at least 100% no matter what was happening. I never heard him on a night when he wasn't completely killing.
Wow.
And I remember one night in Italy when he had like 103 fever, and he was drinking his thing all day, so he was, like all the way in the bag and had a fever. And his synthesizer went out, so they had to bring a Steinway out on the stage. And that turned out to be the best night that I remember playing with him, because everybody was like, leaning in and really checking out what he was doing, because they couldn't really hear it like we used to be able to hear it. And man, he just was so on fire that night. Wow. On just the big Steinway open doing the thing, man. It was great. It was great.
That's very cool. Very cool. Well, I sort of knew how prolific you are as a sideman, but also as a leader, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But just as for a second, you've recorded on over 80 albums as a sideman. As a jazz artist is substantial, to say the least. Can you, at the risk of excluding some, just when you have it, but just some favorite memories, some favorite, some things that jump out at you, maybe important recordings that helped in the growth of your career?
Yeah, sure. One of the first ones I think of as a sideman was a record that I played on under the leadership of drummer Ray Appleton, Otis Ray Appleton. He was from Indianapolis, and he made some records with Freddie Hubbard. And he put together a sextet with Slide Hampton, Charles McPherson, Peter Washington, John Hicks, and me. And I was young. I mean, wow. I hadn't made any records really yet. And Slide wrote all the music.
Wow.
And we recorded at Rudy Van Gelder's. I mean, for me, everything that I would ever think about was like bubbling in my head all at once, And I'm happy to say I got through it, I mean, it was such a great. And I just remember the first solo break that Charles McPherson took. Everybody in the studio went like, "What the?" And it's a great record. It's called "Killer Ray Rides Again," and check out that thing that Charles McPherson plays, because it's on Spotify or wherever, check it out. Yeah. It's really heavy. It's just like, you can just imagine the other cats adjusting their headphones, and all of a sudden this thing comes through, and it's like, oh my God, we're doing like this today. Okay, all right. So yeah, that was a good one. And of course, my first date as a leader for Jerry Teakin's Crisscross label, of course, will always stick in my mind, because I just felt like that was a huge milestone that I had to go past. I always wanted to, and I never, we never know what the future is going to bring, or whether that kind of stuff is going to work out,
Sure.
So I just felt like it was a great time to do it, and he called me, and he used to go out to the clubs and listen to young cats, and there would always be the word spreading through the community. Yeah, Tikus is in town. He's going around to clubs to listen, and I was playing at Smalls with Eric Alexander, and he came through, and I always remember this. Eric called me up the next day. He said, "I think you're going to do a record for Teakins." He called me up last night, and he said, "The little man was burning." so after that, sure enough, he called me a few weeks later, and we did our first date. And he's another guy. I feel the community at that time, because you remember a lot of cats were making CDs then. That doesn't really exist now, but at that time, you could hope to establish something of a career making CDs by labels that would support you, and at least get the music out there and stuff. And that was a big thing, that was.
It sure was. I mean, that's and unfortunately
it's drifting away for sure. I mean, there are a few cats.
It's more challenging now than ever, but that's a great story. Not just to go back to the previous one though, but it must have been awesome to play Slide's charts at that stage of the game, because each one of his is a masterpiece.
Yeah, sure. And these were some tunes that I didn't know. He wrote a tune called the Peanut Butter Song. I forget who he wrote it for, but man, it's so great. And you know how perfect Slide stuff is. It plays so beautifully when you play it. I mean,
it lays so well. It's just genius. Well, let's do shift over a little bit to the solo side of your career.
Okay.
16 albums as a leader, very impressive catalog to say the least. Talk to us a little bit about some that you've done more recently,
Okay.
since your initial flight there with Jerry. But
Yeah.
and also, if you would talk about One for All, which is a group you co-lead with Steve Davis and Eric Alexander, and it's which you're in here in town doing. But that's a very heralded group to say the least.
Yeah, it's very much a fun band to play with. You wanted me to talk about some of my own dates. Things that I recall, I was fortunate enough to do in series different dates for like 3 or 4 different labels, which was cool because the process for making those was different with different producers, as I'm sure you know. So, like for example, I did a record date with a label called Sharp 9, which is no longer in business, I believe, but he was really much more willing to let me do whatever I wanted to do. Jerry Teakins, as I recall, had sort of a list of, he wanted a blues, he wanted a standard ballad, and he wanted something that sounded like it. He, at that time, he kind of changed his philosophy more recently, but at that time he was really he had almost like a template, I guess you might say. And it was cool. I enjoyed that challenge, but then when I got to do something else for somebody else, I realized how cool it is to just say, okay, I got this music that I want to do, I'm going to go do it.
Yeah.
And one really great recollection I have for that Sharp 9 label is making a record called Destination Up, in which he allowed me to use Mulgrew Miller to play the piano, who was a hero of mine and pretty much everybody else's at that time,
Of course.
And that was just so deep, I wrote the music and there he was, and that's a favorite recollection of mine.
That's very cool. Very cool. Yeah, it's another sad loss, losing Mulgrew.
Well, the piano world has taken some hits recently, as we know.
It certainly
it's
has.
Really very, very unfortunate. And then I had the good fortune to have the great Harold Mabern on one of my dates as well, and that's a very strong recollection as well, because he was so strong, that you really didn't have to say anything. Like if you're going to play a ballad, he would easily play just a complete concerto for you before you played a note, and it just set everything up so well. And it's just professionalism in his view. He wasn't thinking of it as any great gift. That's just like that's the way he did it. That's the way you did it from that time. And that was, for a young guy like me, that was really great.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I apologize. I asked you 2 questions at once.
You wanted to talk about One for All too.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. And I was curious just how that group got started, because you guys have been around quite a while now, and
yes,
done a lot of recording and playing all the time live.
Right.
What was the?
So the way that happened was, I don't know, some of our viewers may not remember or be aware of a club that was on the Upper West Side called Augie's. But Augie's was sort of a college bar for the Columbia University students, and it's in the location that now is Smoke.
Right. Okay.
But it was a completely different kind of a scene. It was like sort of like a thrift store that had music every night, And we didn't get paid. We passed the hat. And Joe Farnsworth inherited Fridays and Saturdays there. My friend Joe Farnsworth, the drummer, the great drummer. And so I started doing a lot of those with him, with Eric Alexander, because they were going to William Patterson together, so they were already completely tight. And I knew Joe because his older brother James, the late James Farnsworth, he and I studied at North Texas, so that's how I met Joe. So Joe started putting that band together, and then we would always go hear Art Blakey's band. And as you know, Steve Davis was the final trombonist in Art's band. So, and Joe's from Massachusetts, and Steve was in Hartford, so they were sort of friends. And so Steve started coming by and playing at Augie's with us when he was free, making it a three-horn front line. And that started to gel it. I mean, we didn't have arrangements or compositions or anything at that time, but all the stuff we knew we were making into arrangements on the bandstand. And then I got a weekend at Smalls, and we had been going over to David Hazeltine's crib down in Chinatown, because he just liked to write and he wanted to hear it for 3 horns, and he was living with Brian Lynch.
Oh wow!
They had that crib together down there, and so Brian was always in the next room shedding, and I was like, Jesus Jesus Christ. I'm in here, But so Dave was writing these great arrangements, and I got this weekend at Smalls, and I said, well, let's bring Dave, bring these arrangements, it'll be a band. And that really was like the first, that would have been in 1993 or 4, I would say.
Okay.
And then we didn't have a steady bass player. Peter Washington was doing a lot of it, and John Weber, who now is the steady bass player, was doing a lot of it. And then David Williams, who was playing with Cedar Walton, did some of it. And Dwayne Burno, the late great Dwayne Burno, and quite a few other cats would come in. But for the recordings, it was usually Peter and then later John Weber. So the band now, as it exists, is myself, Eric Alexander, Steve Davis, David Hazeltine, Joe Farnsworth, and John Weber.
Nice.
And it's just playing last night, as I mentioned to you, I got off a plane at 4:30 and we hit at 7:30, and it's like we didn't eat nothing, man. I mean, I was tired, but other than that, the band is so automatic. It's so everybody just hears and thinks the same way. It's great, man. It's really improved.
That's awesome. Are you guys doing any recording coming up?
Well, we did one for the Smoke Sessions label, which is Paul, who owns Smoke, the jazz club, has a label, for whom I neglected to mention, but I did my last leader CD for him as well. It's
cool.
called Dark
Okay.
Blue.
Okay.
And it's one of which I'm also very proud. And we did one, the group One for All did one for Paul, I think 2 summers ago, and I think we're talking about doing one in the spring. So
Nice. All right.
yeah,
Well, we'll look
keep
for
on
that.
rolling.
Look for that for sure. Let's switch gears again and talk about your role as a professor.
Yeah.
In particular, what you're doing in Graz and the program we were talking before the interview started about. What a great program it is. It's got tons of history now, and now you've got tremendous faculty yourself, Luis Bonilla, lots of international greats. Yeah. But just tell us about the program over there and how that's been going for you. I can't remember how long you've been over there, Dalbert.
It's amazing, but I'm starting my 9th year. I can't believe it myself that I've been out of New York for that long. But it's been such a great thing, and I just want to say just a little bit about teaching before that.
Yeah.
Teaching has become, I never envisioned myself as a teacher. I don't know if anybody ever really does anyway, but I came to New York to play like most cats do, but now of course the reality is most players have a teaching segment of what they do, and what I found pretty much immediately was it really defined whether I know what I'm talking about or not. For me to explain it to a student so that he or she can understand it clearly and work on something means that I have to have a really clear idea about what I'm doing. So actually, before I took the Graz gig, I was teaching at Purchase College for a while, and the final year at Rutgers as well. And so I was already sort of putting my teaching together. So when I got to Graz, I felt like I was pretty much ready. I had a pretty clear idea right away, and our mutual friend Ed Neumeister was already there, and he helped me a bunch getting acclimated to the system there, which is slightly different than anything I had dealt with before. And so my job as it is right now, my duties just involve individual lessons.
Okay.
And I have a studio of 15 students, and they're wide variety of styles and approaches, and I'm really happy with all of them, and of course proud of all of them, and proud to be a part of that program. You mentioned Luis Bonilla, he's our newest addition, and we have a really diverse program that's sort of, I would say, geared maybe a little more towards fundamentals than other universities in Europe are. But it's very much like a family there. As a student and as a teacher, we're very close there, and I really like that. It's cool.
Yeah, I've heard so many good things about it, so it's great to hear that directly from you. It's very cool. Talk to us a little bit about, I know you're working with a lot of groups in Europe.
Yeah.
How is, if you were to compare the scene in Europe in terms of playing, and maybe even more from a playing perspective than a teaching perspective, but how would you compare and contrast it to, say, your years here in New York?
Well, the first thing I guess I would say is that just because of the logistical thing of me having lived in New York, it was more difficult for me to be in Europe as often. I mean, now that I live there, for me to go, for example, to Italy, now I go to Italy maybe 6 or 7 times a year and tour with different groups, and that's of course, facilitated by my living there. And I would say that it's easier for me, having established the reputation to whatever degree that I have, to sort of make that work now. 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been so easy, I'm pretty sure. But, the level of musicians over there is very high as well. And there are more and more Americans coming over. So I'm playing with really good musicians, and I'm working on new music all the time and stuff. So it's actually been quite a boon for me artistically, I think. Really creatively, I'm working on a lot of new things now, and new musicians, new styles and stuff like that.
And do you, the electric band that you lead, do you lead that out of Europe, or is it mostly?
It is out of Europe. In fact, well, it originally was a band called Full House that was started here in New York in 2003, co-led by David Hazeltine and I. But then that gig finished. We were playing at Smoke every week, and that gig finished in 2006, and we kind of let it go. And then when I got the job teaching in Graz, I kind of made it a resolution that if I met some students that I thought merited it to be in a band that I would lead, I would use it as a student group to teach them and give me a chance, to write new music in that other kind of format, and experiment with sounds and stuff like that. And, it turned out to be a creative thing for me, a opening for me, so because I didn't plan to do it when I moved over there, but then I thought, this could be a great thing on a lot of different levels, so that's how it happened,
Wow, that's very cool. I'm sure for the students it'd be
they
an
like it.
opportunity. I bet.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Are you active? I think the answer to this is yes, but tell us a little bit about it. Are you active as a guest artist in Europe at various schools around in different? Obviously, there's many different countries you can go.
Yes. Well, one nice thing about this job in Graz also is that the school is very supportive about exchanges and visiting other institutions. So I've been. We actually have an exchange with IU, Indiana, as well.
Oh, really? Wow.
And I haven't done anything there yet in that capacity, but I've done all over Europe. I've done, France and Spain and Italy and Germany. We have these exchanges, and I've gone and done things with, played with the big bands and stuff like that. And it's been a great educational sort of power source for me too. Go meet all these different cats, and there are so many great programs of, as I said before, kind of different varieties of approaches, which is cool.
Yeah, very cool. I remember when we did one of Bob Minster's records, and you played a solo on his arrangement of "Someday My Prince Will Come." I'm pretty sure.
I'm not sure about that, because I remember I only made one record with Bob at the Manchester.
Yeah.
And I played on that Blues in Concert D, and I played on another. I don't think I played on.
I could be. I think, but I can't remember where I parked my car an hour ago. So
You want to know why I played on F7, F sharp? Is that what you want to know?
I want to know how you make that sound so good. That's what I want to know. But I heard a distinct influence from Freddie Hubbard.
Oh. And
you're one of the few who have really been able to kind of take his language and vocabulary, make it your own, but also I'm not asking it very well, but talk to us about the influence that Freddie Hubbard had on you.
And thanks for the comparison, because if anyone would ever think that it's unflattering to be compared to someone else or unoriginal or whatever, I'm not one of those people. the greatness of Freddie Hubbard cannot be denied, obviously. So and actually, Freddie, we became friends. Unfortunately, it was after he started having sort of technical problems playing the instrument, but I used to go hear him anytime he came to New York, and in fact, going back to North Texas days, he used to come through there a lot too, and that was when he was playing incredibly well. One of the most profound musical experiences I can remember was him playing in a quartet with Cedar Walton and Billy Higgins and bassist Herbie Lewis, and he was just so deep on every level, and so when I came to New York and when he would come through, I would always make a point to go to his hotel and visit him and call him up and hang out, and try to how how should I say it, decipher the message? Can we say that?
Yeah.
Decode the message?
I like it.
You know, the thing is, because like, if you ever met or have seen interviews of Freddie Hubbard, he was a guy who's, just like his playing, his mind moved very fast. He didn't really hang out on one subject for a long time. So if you were going to ask him specific things about chords or something, and it changes in a tune or something, he wouldn't maybe be so direct in answering that. But then he might go over to the piano and show me, and I'd get more information from that than anything that he might have said. And, you know, I just, when I first heard him, it was pretty much, I would say, I'm talking about on record, I would say it was kind of all consuming. I just said, because I was late getting to Freddie Hubbard, you know, as I mentioned Clifford Brown, and I had listened to guys like Woody Shaw and Blue Mitchell and Lee Morgan and Art Farmer and a lot of other cats before I got to Freddie. In fact, I sort of thought for some reason when I was in high school that Freddie Hubbard was like a high note guy or something, you know, because he did some of those records in the 80s.
Yeah, right. He did have that side of it.
He did that thing.
Right.
But then when somebody showed me the 1960 stuff, like a record called Ready for Freddie, I was like, you know, I couldn't, again, one of those kind of things where I couldn't believe it and I had to try to approach it, you know. And that's how that happened, I guess. I really think a lot of trumpet players, even today, have a tremendous influence from Freddie Hubbard in there, maybe whether they're aware of it or not. But I feel like his influence was so all-encompassing in certain conceptual ways that there's no way to get around it. You know?
Yeah. I can't remember who told me this, but they said Freddie Hubbard is the Muhammad Ali of trumpet.
Yeah,
I love that analogy because it's just like, it's just everything. Everything is there, you know, from the physical side, technical side to the depth of harmonic knowledge, everything. And then he's got the personality on top of that too. I totally agree. It's a major influence on not just trumpet players, but all brass players, all everybody really.
Absolutely.
I have to ask you this. I'm not really a big equipment guy myself, but I always get people and they say, "Why didn't you ask him what his equipment?" So
I should have brought my horn then. Man.
Well, no. Even if you could just tell us what kind of equipment you're using these days.
So I have this horn that I bought from Bill Mobley, the great trumpet player who lives here in town. I actually bought it from him something like 30 years ago, 25, something like that. It's a Colicchio made in 1945, Dominic Colicchio.
Oh, wow.
Handmade when he was still living in New York. And I've been through all the kinds of trumpets that there are, the new ones and the old ones, the Constellations. I never played a Monette, but mostly because I could never afford one.
Well, there is that.
Cut that out. But anyway, you know, this horn, I always came back to it. Whenever something on another horn would start to feel funny, and I'd say, it felt good for a minute, but I always come back to this Colicchio, and now I don't even really consider that I would change. It's such a great horn, and the sound is just, I really feel like it's the kind of sound that isn't found anymore. The quality of metal, it's just like, it's heavy, man. It's not heavy, you know, but it's really deep. It's a great horn, man.
And Freddie played a Colicchio for.
He played a Colicchio, but he played the horn that he played was completely different in style. His was a super large bore with a big 5.5-inch bell. My horn's sort of more like a Besson or a Ben, just smaller. And easier to play, I think.
Yeah, interesting. What about mouthpiece?
My mouthpieces are made by a cat named Dave Hauser, who's in New Jersey, and nothing really radical. It's basically a modification of a 3C. I had him made a heavier blank that's sort of like a Monette mouthpiece.
If you had some advice for young folks coming up, which I'm sure you give out all the time to your students, but somebody looking at your career and starting now and saying, I want to forge a career and be like Jim Rotondi, what advice would you have?
Well, I think the first advice that I would give is, now that we're in the information age and it's so easy to find a small example of what it is we're trying to do in the music or recording, whatever, I found that musicians don't do the research all the way anymore. It's easy, it's sort of instant gratification on the phone. And I feel like we need to, and this is something I really impart to my students all the time, do the research the right way, whatever you're trying to learn. because it's usually a little deeper than one example of whatever it is you're looking at, you know. And so, you know, I encourage students, like if they go out to a jam session and somebody calls a tune that they don't know, you make a note of that and you go home and you learn it, and the next time you go back, you know it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and this way you're building up your stuff, but you're developing your strength, your confidence, your musicianship, your artistry, all that kind of stuff, you know. And I feel like it's easy to not do that work now, but I think it's critically important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. Jim, I can't thank you enough for coming down. It's been an absolute blast talking to you today. And just summing up, unfortunately this interview will come out after you're already done at Dizzy's this week, but you're at Dizzy's this week.
Yeah.
What's on the horizon in terms of projects, tours, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, as I mentioned, we're hoping to try to put a record together with One for All, so I'm probably going to go home and try to write a couple of things to get ready for that.
Cool.
I have a lot of touring both in and out of the USA coming up in the fall here, and you know, and of course teaching is always happening, you know, so it's always the rotation of the things that I do. And then my wife and I have a home in France, which is my retreat. That's where I go to cool out. You know, we got a Cocker Spaniel.
Nice.
And that's my groove, yeah. So that's what's happening for me.
That's awesome. That sounds great. Jim, thanks so much.
Mike, thanks a bunch, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I hope everybody enjoyed the interview with Jim as much as I did. So great to hear about his extraordinary life in music. Once again, we appreciate all your support. We look forward to bringing you a bunch of exciting new interviews in 2020. Give us a like on Facebook as well as on YouTube. Have happy holidays, and we will see everybody next time on Bone2Pick.